In a retelling of the Galactic Civil War, you never hear much about the exploits of the Rebel Army. As far as the rebellion goes, it's usually all about the flyboys in their X-Wings and blockade runners flying circles around Imperial battleships. And that might be because the victors of any conflict get to kind of control the telling of history. This is a good reason why the New Republic historians typically focus on the Rebel fleet far more than the Rebel ground forces. Simply put, the Rebel Army did not have a very glorious outing during the conflict. They had it pretty rough. I mean, think about it, we only see them 3 times in all the movies. First at Scarif, when a small unit of Pathfinders get vaporized in a suicide mission. Then on Hoth, when a bunch of Rebel troopers fight a futile rearguard action against an Imperial armored assault column. And then finally on the forest moon of Endor, when another small unit of Pathfinders get captured, but then somehow manage to turn things around and defeat the 501st Legion stationed there. Other than that, we don't really know much about these guys at all. And we're going to change that in today's video. We're going to be doing a really deep dive into what the Rebel Army was actually like. What it was like on a daily basis to be fighting for the Rebel Alliance on the ground. We're going to talk about the ideology, how these units were structured, and just how they managed to survive this very crazy and devastating conflict. In this video, we'll be heavily referencing the 61st Mobile Infantry and its exploits from 3 ABY to 5 ABY, as covered in the excellent novel Twilight Company. They are an excellent representation of what the Rebel Army went through during the most hectic and important years of the Galactic Civil War. There's 2 visions of what the Rebel Army actually was. You have the conventional, disciplined, and well-trained force, one that high-minded individual like Chancellor Mon Mothma envisioned in a war of hearts and minds against the Empire. This was a professional force of soldiers marching in cadence, wearing clean, identical uniforms. This was a defensive force that only acted out in violence in order to protect the citizens of the galaxy against the Empire's excesses. And in some ways, you did have units like this. The rear battalions deployed on Hoth to guard the high command at Echo Base were just that. Disciplined, wearing uniforms with insignia on them, and issued new and standardized blasters, usually the A280. They even had permanent quarters, rec rooms, time at the range, standard meal times and rations, training, medical facilities, luxuries that unfortunately like 99% of the Rebel Army just did not enjoy. The makeup of this headquarter unit was also quite different. About a third of the infantry station on Echo Base had been former Imperial cadets before defecting. Another third had gone through Alliance Special Forces training, and there were also a lot of Marines there as well. Many of these individuals had actually never seen combat, and a lot of them were quite ideologically committed to the cause, something you might see less of on frontline units. And so when these frontline units sent a few of their men back to the rear for either additional training or some other purpose, there's usually a big clash in culture and personality between the frontline units and these clean-cut, elite, well-trained individuals who were fully indoctrinated into rebel propaganda. There were usually fistfights. That's how different these 2 groups were. Now, the second image of the Rebel Army, the one that was just more commonly seen, but one that is rarely portrayed in propaganda films put out by Baron Papanuida, were units like the 61st Mobile Infantry, a company-sized unit of around 200 troopers. Established by Captain Mika, Hal, Yvonne. During its inception, the 61st probably looked a lot like some of these headquarter units. They were probably decked out in uniforms. They had some level of discipline and training before being deployed out onto the battlefield. But the Rebel Infantry was probably one of the toughest spots to be in during the Galactic Civil War. While the Rebel flyboys and fleet personnel were able to adopt hit-and-run tactics against the Empire using their heavily armed hyperspace-equipped snub fighters, the Rebel Army didn't enjoy any significant advantage against their Imperial Army or Stormtrooper counterparts. And you'd be surprised how little fighting for the right thing does for your unit's morale. When your enemy not only outnumbers you, but also is better trained and better equipped. This is what the Rebel Army went up against on a daily basis. They were always outgunned. They weren't necessarily faster or more mobile than their enemies, and a lot of units were just wiped out. And remember, when I say Rebel Army, I don't mean Special Forces units or insurgents like Saab's partisans. Rebel Army units don't get to do hit-and-run attacks nearly as much. I mean, they have logistical chains. They have heavy weapons, support staff, and equipment that they can't just leave behind every time they attack. These are much larger and slower moving entities, and so they actually go toe-to-toe with the Imperial Army. which is kind of crazy if you think about it. During the Rebel Alliance's daring mid-rim offensive, the 61st would be at the vanguard of the Rebel advance, and then during the retreat, they would be in the rear guard. As such, this unit was almost completely wiped out on multiple occasions, like during the Battle of Magnus Horn, where they were decimated. They had basically a platoon left by the end of the battle, and they were almost rolled into another unit if it weren't for Captain Hal's insistence that they stay together and preserve the unit's legacy. The mid-rim retreat that followed the mid-rim offensive was a rude awakening for the Rebel Alliance, and especially for the Rebel Army. Up until that point, the Rebels were riding high on the coattails of the destruction of the Death Star. Like a startup company in constant growth, the Rebels were being flooded with supplies and new volunteers, keeping many Army units at full strength and replacing battlefield losses. But it became clear very soon that this rate of recruitment and influx of resources could not be sustained forever, especially once all of the excitement started drying up. More importantly, the Rebels lacked a logistical fleet that was large enough to keep all of their frontline units fed and equipped. And this is why the mid-rim offensive ultimately failed, not because frontline units stopped achieving tactical and strategic objectives. It was because they outran the supply lines. They ran out of food and fuel and munitions, and then once the Rebels lost their momentum, the Imperials started gaining. Units like Twilight Company, who were usually the furthest away from Rebel supply lines, had to source almost everything for themselves. We're not just talking about foraging for food, we're talking about foraging for orders and intel and even recruits. Even though it was strictly against the Rebel Alliance's security policy, with no way of getting reinforcements from the Rebel High Command, they essentially held open recruitment drives at the end of every battle on a newly liberated world or even half-liberated world. So yeah, after a full-on battle, they would pitch up a tent and advertise to the surrounding area that they were accepting new recruits. This is kind of a crazy concept if you really think about it. While most people are grateful to see the arrival of the Rebel Alliance on their home world, you did have angry locals, or worse, Imperial spies, loyalists, or agents infiltrating the ranks, or just people who were upset that their house got blown up during the battle. On one occasion, the 61st Infantry accidentally recruited a assassin, a bounty hunter that was after Captain Hal. Only through pure charisma did he manage to talk this individual down, and she would actually end up joining Twilight Company as a marksman. Such was the charisma of this individual, who I believe used to be a teacher before the Galactic Civil War started. Kind of reminds me of like Tom Hanks in Saving Private Ryan, or Joshua Chamberlain, the 20th Maine during the Civil War. It's kind of sad if you think about it. Combat leaders are just teachers teaching a bunch of dumb kids on how to survive a war, and if they fail in their teachings, those kids end up dying, and that probably happened a lot. Anyway, you'd be surprised how few assassins actually made it through these recruitment drives. These soldiers got good at recruitment. They found the right types of individuals and put them in places to kind of sort through the rabble. The bigger problem is that when you destroy an area by fighting through it, you usually leave the place ruined and full of refugees. There can be a lot of desperate individuals looking to join up for all the wrong reasons, including useless people, including useless individuals, including criminals and cowards who might just want a warm meal and some shelter and don't actually want to fight. That might sound harsh, but when you're in the business of war, you really can't spare much resources for dead weight. You also have the potential of not Imperial spies, but just pissed off civilians infiltrating your unit because you accidentally killed one of their family members or destroyed their property, and now they want to get revenge on you. Sorting through all of these individuals just is not an easy thing, especially if you're just using soldiers who are not trained to do this vetting process. It's not like you have rebel intelligence or psych evaluations going on. Oftentimes, it's just a bunch of squad leaders who are choosing individuals that they think might be good replacements for the individuals they just lost in the previous battle. I mean, the whole thing was just very makeshift and very ad hoc. Now, usually if they were lucky, the 61st managed to find 3 or 4 able-bodied recruits to turn into proper soldiers. But then again, the lifespan of a recruit just isn't great, because this is an active unit, usually on the front. I mean, there's no boot camp conditioning or training rooms. Instead, these individuals were given something known as the White Book, which was kind of like an infantry manual created by the Alliance High Command. It outlines the 4 phases of infantry training that every rebel trooper would get that these new recruits totally would not get. It also outlined all the rules and regulations that these new recruits would definitely not follow because the veterans didn't follow it. I mean, the truth is, the Alliance High Command mostly were defected Imperial officers who had seen the importance of discipline and order while they were in the service, but what they failed to understand was that the rebellion was full of desperados, criminals, and down-on-luck warriors who really had nowhere left to go. Everyone else who had opportunities in life, who had a life worth living, gave these recruitment drives a wide berth. What the Rebel Alliance got were, the leftovers, the individuals who had nothing else to lose. There's honestly nothing really romantic about war in the trenches. I mean, maybe if you were in the Rebel Starfighter Corps and managed to avoid any major battle against the Empire, you could preserve that starry-eyed look and talk about your dreams fighting for democracy and the restoration of the Republic. But such thoughts and ideas were reserved for the High Command and civilians that hopefully will one day get to enjoy a bit of freedom when they're rebuilding the galaxy. But again, in the trenches, it was just all about surviving until the next battle. Individuals who started talking politics were disliked. Individuals who talked about and dreamed about heroics were ignored or considered foolish and dangerous. And people who followed the White Book and all those rules and regulations, well, let's just say most of the enlisted, including a lot of the pilots, thought that the White Book was just a complete joke, an insult almost. Many considered it a fascist attempt to turn rebel troopers into stormtroopers. These were the type of rogues the High Command was dealing with. These were individuals who rebelled because they do not follow rules. And the High Command had to just basically deal with them because the price in blood they paid was so high that it'd be immoral to do anything else. Plus everything else that's promised in the White Book, like, proper training, 3 square meals, air support, also were missing. So you don't expect people to follow those rules if you don't hold up your end of the bargain. Anyway, new recruits were trained on the DLT-28 blaster rifle, either at a makeshift range planetside or on board the Thunderstrike in the ship's internal range. The Thunderstrike was a CR-90 Corvette. It was the 61st's barracks and transport. At 150 meters in length, with a crew of around 50 sailors, there's hardly any room for the 200 troopers on board and all of their gear and rations, but they made do. Now, once assigned to a squad and a bunk, a recruit's training really varied depending on that squad leader and what the unit was doing at the time. If a squaddie proved to be useful, good at following orders and not a complete liability and moron, then they would usually get more training. People would invest more time into learning their names and teaching them how to throw a detonator properly. Sooner rather than later, these recruits would find themselves in a life-threatening situation, in a firefight, learning on the job from amateurs who had learned on the job. Typical day for a rebel trooper involved waking up usually in a bivouac or in some kind of occupied building they took over planetside. Then they had a quick breakfast and then busy work. That could mean patrols, equipment checks, scouting for food and water sources because, again, logistics were terrible. These guys were basically a primitive invading army that were living off the land, foraging in the woods, and pillaging villages, which of course wasn't great for Mon Mothma's whole heart and mind's PR strategy. You also had the troops constantly drilling and searching for escape routes in case a larger Imperial force attacks. Although generally Twilight Company was an attacking force that was usually on the offensive, their numbers were just really small. And while Imperial Army units had pretty low morale and rarely launched enthusiastic attacks against enemy forces, you always had the threat of running into a very well-armed and motivated stormtrooper unit, which only spelled trouble. This isn't the movies where stormtrooper units were a joke. Rebel Infantry always struggled against these elite vanguard units, and were basically on par with Imperial Army troopers when it came to skill, morale, and equipment. And here's the other thing that the New Republic really doesn't want you to know. I mean, oftentimes, like most of the times, especially during the Mid-Rim offensive, the Rebel Army was fighting loyal Imperial citizens that were armed by the Empire, or just, proxies and mercenaries armed by the Empire. And being a very undisciplined and poorly equipped force, the rebels committed a lot of war crimes, for sure. Such as the nature and complexity of war. I mean, if you zoom in enough to any battle, it can really be hard to tell who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. Like I said, those lofty political ideas are meant for when the battle stops, when you have time to breathe. Oftentimes, these galactic civil wars are just, theaters for confusion, pain, and violence and death. Nothing more. The comms officer in the unit was also incredibly important and glued to the radio, listening for both unencrypted Imperial comms, but also listening out for Rebel comms, especially after Battle Hoth, which marked the end of the disaster's Mid-Rim retreat. The Rebel Alliance High Command basically went into hiding, and every individual Rebel Army unit and naval unit was left on their own devices in order to scatter across the galaxy. This is kind of like the Rebel Alliance's Order 66. Twilight Company was lucky enough to have the Thunderstrike and Brachatook class gunship, Apeliana's Promise, escorting them, a lot of other units weren't as lucky and were just trapped planetside and hunted down until they were destroyed. Twilight Company would lose their commander during the Battle of Hoth at Echo Base, and this basically was the end of Twilight Company functioning in a larger battle group where they could share resources and coordinate attacks with other companies or even battalion-sized units. For a while, they were a part of Barma battle group led by General Harrison Dula, but now they're just functioning by themselves without any orders, without any connection to high command, very little intel. It's kind of a scary thing. Just 200 men on 2 ships. Replacing Hal was a veteran of the unit, Sergeant Hazram Namir, who himself had been a child soldier on a violent primitive world before joining up with Twilight Company. All he had known up until this point in time was warfare, one tribe killing another tribe for God knows what reason. Actually, when he encountered the rebellion for the first time, he was hired as a primitive warrior to guard a major Imperial installation. He was basically given a blaster and an energy pack, and that was enough to buy his loyalty. When he became commander of Twilight Company, he had a very cynical attitude of an old man who had been at war for a lifetime. But this really was the mentality you needed to have survived in the Rebel Infantry, especially in a unit that saw as much action as the 61st. This unit over the course of the Galactic Civil War might have suffered 500, 1,000% casualties. The churn was so crazy that by the end of the war, you had almost 0 original members that survived. It was just new faces, new people all the time. At one point, they even lose a Thunderstrike in a pivotal battle on Solus. And the sad thing is, Twilight Company never really had time to bury their dead. Oftentimes, especially during boarding missions in space or more hectic assaults, they never recovered the dead at all. And so there was this tradition, this ceremony that Twilight Company held in their vehicle bay, where squaddies of the deceased would take a power pack, ideally a power pack that belonged to one of these individuals, and then they would dispel the charge of these power packs into the vehicle charging station. It's kind of a metaphor, these individuals' energy are joining the ship one last time. And so the CR-90 Corvette was the Twilight Company's legacy until the Battle of Solus, that is. So by this point of this very depressing video, if you're still watching this, you might be asking me, Alan, why did anyone join the Rebel Army? It seems like a terrible deal. Why didn't people just defect or leave? Are people really just suicidal? Well, I actually think this is a pertinent lesson, especially for Americans that were born in my generation, who grew up in an unprecedented time of peace and prosperity. Yes, we had a few financial collapses, Mayan and AI doomsdays, and a war against a bunch of cave-dwelling Neanderthals. But all things considered, our lives in the larger course of human history are just not that bad. Not 1930s bad or 2030s bad. I joke, but not really. The question isn't how did people endure the hard conditions of the Rebel Army? The question is, how bad were the conditions for these people that they actually joined the Rebel Army? This is really the main downfall of both the Republic and the Empire. Both government organizations failed in their mandate to protect and provide for their populace. Yes, we oftentimes think of government as a way to seize power and control people and be corrupt, but at its core, government is always service to the people. Even a dictator's main role is to serve the people and make sure that they're too busy working a career and job, too busy taking care of their family to actually go out there and do something as crazy as pick up a blaster and fight the government. In my youth, I've seen many conflicts and protests and movements, and I understand and I can relate to the passion of youth, this desire to go out there and change the world. When you're young, when you don't have much to lose, when you have this energy and lack of experience, you're vulnerable. That's why they recruit young men into military service. We are ripe picking at that age. Too dumb to know any better without anything better to do. But as I've gotten older, as I've started a family for myself and started not just living for myself, but for other people, that passion and desire to go out there and just pick up a blaster and cause chaos has waned as well. Now, if everything was taken away from me, if my home, my family was all ripped away from me, then my tune would change. If you take the ability of a man to live freely or to make a living, if you rip away their dignity and purpose, then yeah, maybe joining a cause like the Rebel Army doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world. It's not that most men have death wishes. It's just most of us want to be useful, want to have a purpose in life. This is probably why in retirement men oftentimes flounder, whereas women flourish. They find hobbies, they find new communities, they go travel, and they have a good time, generally speaking. For a certain percentage of men, if we don't have battles to fight, even if they are artificially created ones, like climbing the corporate ladder, paying a mortgage, or buying groceries, then we'll find a battle or invent a battle to fight. And that can be a problem. Most people don't see the larger galactic picture, the politics. Most people just see the men standing beside them and the ones on the other side they're supposed to kill. We are simple beasts, and simple beasts go to war.